I'll do my best to give you some examples, some of the stuff that I deal with at MSC. For those that aren't familiar, military strategic commitments is the ADF's interface with whole of government in terms of an ADF commitment to an operation or ADF commitment to something that we are partaking at the time, whether it be inside a domestic space or offshore. So I'll do my best to contextualise what I can at the level of classification that we're talking about. If things don't make sense or there's stuff that you want to talk about afterward, I'm happy to catch you later on when I have no mic and we can discuss it to give you the information. The scope, always going to have a scope slide. In straightforward context, I'm going to bring you up to the strategic level and explain why things, well, attempt to explain why things end up the way they are, and then leave it at that point, and then they'll be contextualised by the other speakers as they come in after me. So the genesis of an issue, when we talk about an issue at the strategic level, from what we are concerned about, you may get some strategic indicators and warnings. Now, all going well, your strategic indicators and warnings might come from your whole of government Australian intelligence community. If it's gone really well and your strategic indicators and warnings are focused correctly, then they're going to give you lots of heads up. They're going to give you plenty of information, and it's going to be analysed, and there'll have been plenty of time for them to consider and to give you good guts information. Now that happens, it happens. I'll just say it happens. There are times when, I should say, inside defence specifically, DIO is with the Strategic Intelligence Agency that we deal with all the time. They'll give us our threat assessments, they'll give us our intelligence on what may be happening in a theatre as it's coming up in order to determine what we need to do in terms of an ADF commitment further down track. The annual strategic review and the quarterly strategic review are documents that are done inside Strategic Policy Division, and they provide a cue as to things that might be coming up in the next 5 to 10 years. And they give us an idea of, oh, this is an area here. And I'm speaking very generally for a reason. So they are classified documents, and we can pull information from those and to give us an idea of where we may need to look as it comes forward. Then you have an operational or a tactical indicator and warning. Something may happen and you may not be prepared for that happening. Something might occur in your geographic region. Let's use the Philippines and Marawi as an example. While it had been going for a small amount of time, it didn't really catch our attention for a little bit of time before something had to be done. And in terms of that, it didn't give the strategic agencies a long lead time, which means things turned reasonably quickly to provide an outcome or a suggestion to government as to how we would move forward. And then, of course, there's always the one that will catch you on the hop, and that is something that pops into the media. And if it pops into the media and we have no indicators and warnings, either tactical or strategic, social media generally has a way of making its presence known very quickly and catching the attention of everyone very quickly. That can lead to very short notice planning and providing incomplete or potentially incorrect advice initially to government if you don't have the whole picture. So it's important to have your strategic indicators and warnings queued where you can, where resources allow. And of course, this ability to share broadly with a coalition helps us quite well and positions us very well for this context. And then, of course, there's Government Australia policy. So, put simply, policy is the decision made by the government of the day. So, if the government has said to us, you are to go and engage with this country, let's just say Kamaria, and you are to go and be friends with Kamaria now. Previously, they've always been our opponents in various exercises that we've been in around the world. Well, that's the government decision of the day, and we'll do our best to make that occur. And how you engage with that government, or sorry, that country Kamaria and those rebel forces that we've never liked, really becomes part of the solution in terms of our policy and how we then implement strategic direction into JOC to provide that into the JTF, who then provides the subordinate elements to then implement the government of Australian policy. And probably one of the more important points to realise is that the military in itself does not run the effect that you're after. The military is in fact a political effect. So the military enforces government policy or provides an opportunity for government to enforce a policy if it needs to do so. Or it doesn't necessarily need to be enforcement by that way, it could be soft power as well. So it provides that opportunity for the government to say, engage with this country over here, i.e. Kamaria, and with Kamaria, do good things, and let's improve our influence as we go forward, similar to what our previous speakers have mentioned. So our strategic process, as in the ADF strategic process, is Government Australian policy driven. If you go through the, in terms of Australia's national interests, they're outlined in the white paper, 2016 white paper. And then, of course, backed up again in the 2017 foreign policy white paper released by DFAT, obviously 2017. And then we go into what we have as a classified version of things called the Defence Planning Guidance. And inside the Defence Planning Guidance, it talks about our longer term aims and how we want to influence those countries that may be outlined in the DPG. Straight out of the Defence White Paper the Australian White Paper. So if you're looking in the top, the words that have been picked are very, very specific, and they allow you to niche and look to where we're doing our operations around the world. You could tie every operation that we do to these strategic defence interests. So a secure, resilient Australia with secure northern approaches and proximate sea lines of communication. Okay, well that we're talking about any domestic operation that we do here, anything that we do in our region to protect Australia's interests. If we then go further and we go securing a newer region encompassing maritime, Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, well, that's all the operations that we're doing in the Southwest Pacific as well as into Southeast Asia. Indo-Pacific Endeavour is a good example. For those of you that aren't aware, it was a joint task group that sailed up through Southeast Asia last year. Very influential. It was the largest task group that had sailed inside Southeast Asia for 40 or 50 years from memory. And then, of course, a stable Indo-Pacific and a rules-based global order. A rules-based global order. You'll hear that constantly being reiterated by government. So that is, where we are right now over in the Middle East and helping out with a rules-based global order. Going down into the strategic defence objectives, or the SDOs, as you'll see them in CDF's documents as they go further down: deter, deny, defeat, make effective military contributions, and of course, again, contribute military capabilities to coalition operations. Now, not all of those are kinetic actions. In fact, the vast majority of those are not necessarily kinetic actions. And this is where the broad remit of the ADF comes in. And it is very, very apparent when we speak with our coalition partners that the quality of our sailors, soldiers and airmen is very valued as part of a contribution inside the coalition. And while you're looking at points for building partner capacity and looking at how we can improve things and the lessons that we should draw, I think it's sometimes very important to recognise the bright spots inside that, i.e. what you have done very well in the past, and build on that as you go forward. Don't forget the bright spots, looking at what are the things we need to improve. This gives you an indication of where MSC, and you could replace MSC and put the ADF, it doesn't much matter, reaches out on any one day, and in terms of who we would engage with in terms of an operation or a commitment that's coming forward. And you were right, it's quite bright under those lights. MSC isn't the centre of the universe in this particular diagram. It just gives you an indication of who we reach out to speak. But in terms of a whole of government perspective, we don't just take MSC's views, as in an ADF uniform view, forward to a conference or to a planning, interdepartmental planning meeting and discuss, hey, this is how we're going to do things. We speak to our international policy colleagues. In fact, we won't go as a military uniform forward without policy advice. We cannot go forward without that information. And policy is driven, again, Government Australia policy. Our IP colleagues speak directly with DFAT and they grab that DFAT perspective before they go forward. I'll speak to a little bit of that in a sec. Getting a whole of defence perspective before we go into whole of government allows us to interact on the whole of government space. And when you're talking about decision making, the highest decision making body in the land, which is in the top right corner of the diagram, being the National Security Committee of Cabinet, we need whole of government collaboration to go forward to provide that congruent advice, which is consistent with government Australian policy and also meets the intent of what would be required from military force. Considerations for any operation or before a new operation kicks off. Our preparedness and our concurrency. So there's a lot of work done by a lot of people in preparedness in various services and creates these documents, the CDF Preparedness Directive, and then of course however it filters down from there for the individual services. Inside that, it gives you an indication of what we can provide straight off the bat with status requirements over the top. So, the occasional things, hey, we can't do this for the moment because we've got a problem with this particular capability. However, before we commit to an operation, we need to consider the preparedness, but also the concurrency impacts. So if we're already employing a limited resource in Iraq or in Syria, then why would we then be committing it elsewhere and creating concurrency impacts if we can't generate the capability to then require it for later on. Concurrency and preparedness are one of the first things that we will draw from as MSC before we go into a planning conference. The legal and policy basis. So the policy basis, as I've already said about the Government of Australia policy, but also the legal basis. So we are in Iraq because we're at the collective self-defence of Iraq on invitation from the Iraqi government. That's why we're in Iraq, and that's why we are why we have the continued legal basis for staying there. And in terms of rules of engagement, they're then built as a result around that legal and policy basis. We can't go into an area if we're not actually party to a conflict that's going on. Similar to when we think about it in a state context. So if we're talking about defence assistance to the civil community, the ADF just can't turn up and start helping out Queensland post a tropical cyclone going through, i.e. Debbie. We need an invitation from the state of Queensland to say, hey, we need federal assistance, i.e. in this case the military, and then we come forward and we provide that assistance. We can't just turn up and start doing things. Now, DAC 1, bear with me, but in those cases, that's the way it would work. Unilateral, bilateral or coalition, or as we are probably will see soon, like-minded nations getting together and thinking we should do something over here. How we prepare and how we feed into that side of the house is also very important. And therefore, what contribution do we provide? So if we use the task group TARGI example, what are we providing and what can other partner nations provide? And therefore, we don't actually have to bring the entire package. And if we don't have to bring the entire package, what does that mean in terms of how we fit into the coalition? And therefore, what we can say or what our coalition partners will say, and is that in accordance with our policy? And is that in accordance with our legal construct? It can get quite tricky. If we were to use an example of Kamaria, if we committed to an operation in Kamaria to help mentor and train their ability to counter Daesh, if we were to use that as an example, and that country said, hey, we don't want you to be speaking to your media or going out in the media before we've had a chance to go out with ours, then that is something that needs to be considered very closely inside the coalition, i.e. when can you speak or when is it appropriate for you to speak as we go forward. Supporting or supported and cultural issues. This has been well touched on by the previous presenters, and this is actually a very critical issue. So an interesting anecdote that I've heard many times since we've been in the Philippines has been, we like the way that you are approaching your training. The training that you're provided is treating us as peers, and it is true, it's peer-related training activities. That is what is going on. Importantly though, it's not going in and saying, well, let's just say we turn up in Kamaria and we say, hey, you've got to use our stires, you've got to use this piece of equipment, and you have to use this because that is the best way of doing it. Well, it may not be. And in fact, the way that the Filipinos do things, they've been doing it for many years and quite successfully. They just need a little bit of, they've asked for a little bit of assistance, and here we are helping them out in peer-related training. And it's working very well. They appreciate that side of the house. That is coming out very well. And culturally, the way that our training teams or our mentoring teams are going over there and adapting is very impressive, and it's coming out very well in all of the, in the political speak and the political rhetoric that comes back into Australia. Of interest, there was a fighter pilot mate of mine, as much as I don't like to laud fighter pilots, was up in the Philippines recently, and he went under a period of instruction with one of the Australian teams in the M16. Very simple drills. And he said it was the best period of instruction he'd been given in his entire ADF career. So that gives you a pretty good indication of the standard at which he's being trained and the standard and quality that is being delivered by our people out in the field. Very, very high praise from a fighter pilot. Considerations of the threat. So, are we contributing to the threat? I.e., have we overstayed our welcome because we are there that we are now being threatened? Or are we part of the system that is defeating the threat? I.e., are we taking and aiming to defeat Daesh? So are we part of the rules-based global order as we go through? Speed of response, how quickly we can respond. If you look at it in a DAC context, if we can contribute assets before a commercial entity can, then we're probably the right asset to go forward and help them do that. However, if somebody else can do the job, then why would you actually employ the military to do that? We've got other things to do. Go back to the Defence White Paper. There's more important things for us to do than, say, turn up and sandbag and help somebody out here. So the speed of response can be important. Sometimes, if we can use an example of a tropical cyclone going through the Fiji recently, they may ask us to move something from here to here, and we may not be able to do it in the time frame that's required. So sometimes we have to say no as a result, and therefore we might necessarily make a decision to assist as we go through. The duration of the operation. It's important that for an operation that the end state is stated up front. Why? A lot of it will come down to length of commitment, and length of commitment comes down to dollars. And the amount that we are contributing, dollars-wise, obviously, we have a finite economy. So a lot of this comes into, we need to cost our operations. So all of these considerations come through when we're talking about writing papers for government for them to consider what we're going to do in that context. And if I can use an example of a cabinet submission for an operation, they are about, and I say around 10 pages. So we have to tell government what we are going to do in 10 pages, and of that 10 pages, it is a whole of government submission in most cases. So we don't own the entire 10 pages. So of that 10 pages, we need to be able to explain what people are doing on the ground and how they're going to achieve that in the time frame that they're being provided, and what metrics of success are we going to use. So what is the end state at the end of this commitment? And the commitments are generally, 12 months to 2 years is what we'll put in a paper. So in that time frame, there's probably 2 pages that we will talk about what you are going to do for the next 12 to 18 months inside that operation. 2 pages. And of those 2 pages, we then provide an oral brief for our minister that sits over the top. And then of that, in that 2 pages, that summarises the 12 pages down to 2. Hey, these are the key points you really need to focus on. And on the back of that, there's 1 page that may have 3 or 4 talking points. 3 or 4 sentences that our minister's now representing our case for why we need to continue in an operation or be part of an operation. So I won't say it's the art of the paper that wins the war, or the art of the pen, but it can be very critical in the way that you write the commitment. And a lot of this stuff, and what I haven't put on there is lessons. Lessons in terms of how we got our papers through previously, as opposed to how we fought our war previously. Sometimes we need to be in front of an operation before it starts, and we have a guess, an educated guess as to how things went. Look, we've worked over here before, this worked all right. This evolution, all of a sudden, Daesh capitulates inside Iraq. Oh, what's the next step? We've got to provide that advice to government so we can shape the forces that's going before our forces deploy, so they can prepare as they go forward. And of course, there's always alternatives. You don't always need the military. There is whole of government. We partner with whole of government. And when it's offshore in terms of a crisis, DFAT has the lead. So the ADF does not have the lead. In this case, head of mission, the representative of government, has that lead. So there may be alternatives, maybe commercial alternatives. You don't necessarily need the ADF all the time. This diagram up the front is trying to put what I've just said into into pictures, my words into pictures. But I'll just quickly run down on the left-hand side. This is sort of an unclassed version of how things work. If you look on the left-hand side, that's a government decision-making. All going well, it happens up the very top left-hand corner, i.e. NSC, Prime Minister, Cabinet, they have a bit of a chat in a room, a lot, not as dissimilar to this room in terms of probably a very flash table, but they have a chat, and our Minister is our representative in terms of the ADF commitment to operations, or defence commitment to operations. So as part of that, she may have, depending on the topic, in this case if it's an ADF operation, CDF and Secretary will be co-opted. They'll be able to sit in the room and they'll be able to go through this side of stuff. They'll make their decisions and they'll have that discussion based on the paper that we have provided forward in terms of a whole of defence submission as it goes forward. That decision will be made, and then it may come down onto the left-hand side of the diagram. Now on the left-hand side of the diagram, CDF makes his decision and drives his orders down, and MSC cut the orders for CDF. And so when you see that CDF execute order, that's come from MSC. And of course, using his words. So it's not something we're just making up and just saying, just go off and do this and don't tell CDF. So that is your legal order to get on and do things. We only ever direct JOC or the services to get on and do things. And then JOC at the operation level, or the services, depending on what the task is, tell the subordinate units to get on and do things. Okay. If we go back on the left-hand side, if there is a crisis, then this IDETF, I-D-E-T-F, in the Departmental Emergency Task Force stands up, and head MSC represents defence inside the IDETF. And this might be something that's a crisis offshore. Let's just say a cyclone's gone through Fiji. Head MSC will go across and represent defence. And those issues that we talked about before in terms of the issues that need to be considered all get caught up in that point. The strategic direction, is where it will come from CDF saying, hey, this is how the ADF's going to get on and do its ops. Typically, we're within a whole of government context. There's a whole of government decision to go off and do things in operations. Even if it's a kinetic operation, there's still whole of government action that's going on in the background to make things to accord with policy. Host nation always has primacy, always has primacy. And that is generally one of the biggest priorities. So we will always consider what the host nation wants, always. End state for the ADF is defined up front. That has worked well in most of our operations. You know, an end state might be a fiscal constraint, i.e. you've got 12 months to sort this out. Maybe just as simple as that. We commit capability where civil agencies do not possess the capability or they don't have they can't get there in time, as discussed. And we provide effects rather than specified assets. We don't say we will send one combat engineering team over here and then they can just sit there and do combat engineering stuff. We talk about what effect you actually want. Well, we want to be able to mentor these forces to be able to do maritime security operations. Okay, well that's going to involve this sort of a construct as we go forward. And wherever possible, we always transition to the civil authority so we can get on and do our other business that's required. Our challenges are synchronising multiple decision cycles and information management across the whole of government, across our department, and of course inside a coalition. It just gets more and more difficult as you go across into a coalition. So, you know, thankfully, not part of it, but the serious strikes, coordinating that across those three governments, I imagine, would have been quite difficult in terms of the decision cycles and who we're going to tell at what point. You know, we've got to tell our coalition partners they'll feel left out. So at some point they've got to tell them. But how they coordinated that would have been quite difficult. So that gives you context that wasn't with us. But in terms of how we then get our message across inside of, let's just say, PNG Assist 2018, where we were going up to help the PNG folks up in the Southern Highlands. Our ability to cross-reference our messaging in terms of timing with just DFAT and then the PNG government was difficult because we couldn't, as good as communications are, sometimes you just can't catch people. You know, the government of the day, they're busy doing other things, you know, preparing for other things that are going on at the time. And anticipating challenges in a complex environment, this is a very good example of Iraq. Iraq rapidly changed last year, at the end of last year. It changed so fast that we were not keeping up with the rate of change, how fast they capitulated. And it was generally, or it was done by quite a few people, some of which are in the room, in terms of the work that they did at the time. Anticipating that change, getting in front of what's happening on the ground to give that advice to the strategic level to allow them to make decisions, to allow us to continue in our operations, to adapt our operations to move forward, is quite challenging. Measuring the effect. Now, Jeff mentioned KPIs. The ability to grab that at strategic level and saying, oh, we've trained 2,300 people. Well, that really doesn't mean much in terms of strategic effect. We've actually made this change. These people can now do this. They can now fish for a day, as opposed to they couldn't fish before, they didn't know what a fishing rod was. Measuring that effect and providing that into a tangible outcome can be quite difficult. And much better than me, in the National Policy Division, can turn things around, which is incredible in the way that they write things. But measuring the effect is quite a difficult thing to do. I shall leave it at that point. That's one of our Hercules, but not our people jumping out. So that gives you an indication of who was smart and who was not. So.